Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Welcome to our program again. Today's topic, and again next week, a two-part series, is on a series of topics one could interview a guest about, and is the greatest crime ever in the history of this planet. We're going to talk about the Holocaust that took place under the Nazis, and how awful it was. And we are very, very fortunate to have as our guest today Bill Prosher, who's an expert on the Holocaust, and our topic is the horrors of the Holocaust of World War II. Our guest, Bill Prosher, holds a BA degree in English from Pacific University. He holds a master's degree in English from Arizona State University. He holds a second master's degree in administration from the University of Idaho, and he received his PhD degree from Gonzaga University in educational leadership with an emphasis on prominent thinkers of Judaism. Bill, I've known you a long time, and I welcome you to the program. And you recently spoke at North Idaho College, and you were just so eloquent in talking about this terrible, terrible crime that took place and the millions that died. Welcome to our program. I know our viewers are going to be very much informed with your expertise.
Thank you, Tony. It's very nice to be here with you, Janelle. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
As always, I'm pleased to have a regular panelist, Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and Janelle will commence today's question on the horrors of the Holocaust.
Bill, welcome to the program. We're going to talk about the Holocaust today, but so that people in the viewing audience know what we're talking about, can you define the Holocaust? Tell us, what is it?
Yeah, the Holocaust generally is viewed as starting in 1933, when Hitler takes over and becomes chancellor. And it ends probably with the end of hostilities in Europe in 1945. And during that essentially 12-year period, from a Jewish perspective, you could go from being completely assimilated as a Jew in Germany to the death camps. And what fascinated me in studying the subject was how rapidly that takes place. And secondly, what are the conditions that allow that? And as Tony mentioned, you know, in terms of scale and scope, this has to rank up there with the worst crimes in history. It's interesting that more people were killed under the Russians, and so the Holocaust is not unique in that way. And so one of the discussions or problems in the study is, in what sense is this event unique? And that term Holocaust comes really from the Old Testament. It's a whole burnt offering to God. So from a Jewish point of view, that's essentially what was. They would probably prefer the term Shoah. That's often used. And there are other terms as well, but everyone seems to know it as the Holocaust. For instance, the museum in Washington, D.C. took that name so that we could talk about it, and they're very interested in ongoing studies. So they sponsor anyone who wants more information on the subject. That would be a great source, and it's on the web and readily available.
Now, the Holocaust, though, didn't involve just Jews. It involved other people as well. Can you explain some of the other groups that were also involved? Although, of course, the Jewish population was the largest group.
Right. The Nazis had a whole list of people that they didn't particularly like. Among them, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, socialists, homosexuals, Catholics, and in one case, although they didn't like Jehovah's Witnesses and they interned them and so on, they often trusted them, and they often had high-ranking positions in the camp in terms of administrating from a prisoner point of view, from a prisoner perspective or level.
When you did your presentation, again, as I've indicated in introducing you, that you're truly an expert, I was particularly interested in how you analyze the beginning of the implementation of the Holocaust and the concentration camps and the genocide that went on. We hear a lot about that here in the early 21st century. Bill, you have a four-step process, and I think it's not only very important from a historical perspective of how it was carried out, but secondly, it's a warning to countries around the world of what those processes are, that it could possibly happen again.
Sure. And one of the things that I try and remember is, in talking about the subject, is a sense of humility that was kind of instructed by the survivors. And they would say that really there are no experts on this subject. We're all just students. We're all trying to learn. And I found that perspective helpful. So I join with you and all your viewers in trying to get our minds around such a dark subject. It's often called the dark revelation. And one of the first scholars to seriously attempt to answer that question of how it started was a man named Raoul Hilberg, who unfortunately has passed away, but he worked at the University of Vermont. And he established what he calls the 4 steps. And the first step was identification. In other words, who is a Jew? And as you know, this question is still being debated. Does a Jew come from the mother's side, or the biblical version of it's patriarchal? It comes, you're a Jew if your father is a Jew. History intervenes again with the Crusades, and so many Jewish women were raped that the father was not always easily identifiable, but the mother always is. And so there was a historical shift. And so the question is still open to debate, and even the Nazis had a very difficult time in trying to define this. They would come into school classrooms based on their scientific, what they thought was a scientific background of eugenics, and have glass eyes, which they would match with the student's eye color to try and determine who is Jewish. Or they would measure the nose or put calipers on your skull to try and identify who is a Jew. But really, the Jews were identified by their own cooperation. They went to the synagogue and got the list of members of the Jewish community. So there is constantly this questioning among the Jews themselves, to what extent did we cooperate, and obviously the guilt associated with that. But the first step was identification. And the second step, once they were identified, then a series of laws were passed in which Hilberg calls it the second step of expropriation, where everything of value is gradually removed from the victim, so that they have no means of defense, no means of support. And this was consciously done. This was thought out very carefully and practiced. And the Nazis got better and better and better at it as time went on. So under that, jobs would be taken. You couldn't practice law, you couldn't practice medicine, pretty soon you couldn't teach. And it's interesting for us in the academic field that many survivors have told me that the academics were the first to capitulate to the Nazi ideology, and the universities were notorious about identifying, giving up their Jewish professors, and so on and so forth. So that second step of expropriation then prepared the ground for the very important third step, which Hilberg called ghettoization, taking this population and putting them in a ghetto, restricting their movement, restricting their ability to defend themselves in any way. And there were many different kinds of ghettos. In the case of Warsaw, it was a brick ghetto with glass shards at the top and so on. In other instances, in villages perhaps, it was simply a known space that the Jews lived in. And immediately that was overcrowded, and then any other means of, all valuables were taken, radios, weapons obviously, and Jews were left in this defenseless state. And continually the Nazis moved in other populations to force a kind of unreal crowding situation, sanitation problems, food problems. And one of the interesting things that survivors told me is in the Warsaw Ghetto, all during this time, they still tried to provide a civilized life. And they still had soup kitchens, they organized education for children, they had plays, not only being written, but history being written and hidden. And if you go to the museum today, you can see one of the milk cans that was dug up in the Warsaw Ghetto recording everything that happened in diary form. So those historical records tell us a lot about what it was like in the ghetto. Once the population has moved into the ghetto, the Nazis were then ready for the final step, which Hilberg calls annihilation. And in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, since the people I traveled with were from the Warsaw Ghetto, they said the constant requirement for 10,000, 20,000 to report to the railroad station to be shipped had a major effect in everything that happened. And people would have a pass that they could get out of that, or if they joined the Jewish police. So the Jews themselves were made to cooperate in their own destruction. And one of the difficult questions that arises is people will say Jews went like lambs to the slaughter. They did not resist. And this is very troubling to those survivors. And they wanted me to make a point always when I talk that there was resistance. And they even talk about such a thing as spiritual resistance, where if somebody was being marched to the train station with their wife and 3 or 4 children, which took more courage, to attack one of the guards with a submachine gun and to know it meant certain death, or to comfort your children, stay with your wife till the very end, maybe suspecting what's coming, not really being sure, but not attacking, not using violence, and comforting those who remained. And there are heartbreaking instances. For instance, a well-known educator had a day school, and the children were lined up and marched to the train station thinking they were going on a picnic. Their teachers stayed with them, they packed little knapsacks, and they were marched to the trains to take them to Treblinka, completely unaware of what was in store for them. But the people guiding them thought that was best. That was to keep it unknown till the very end when there was no further chance.
There's so many warning signs here, and we'll come back to this.
Sure.
And relate it to some activities in the world today and warning signs around the world with genocide today. Janelle Burke.
There have to be certain factors that are in place in order to allow something this horrendous to occur. What are some of those factors that people have identified that might have to be in place in order for these kinds of events to occur?
Simon Wiesenthal has set out about 6 of them, and among them are a small group, a minority, a climate of fear, a legislation that is willing to go along. As you know, Hitler co-opted the legislative branch of the government, the judicial branch of the government, and the executive branch of the government. So there really is no form of redress. There's no escape. For Jews to get to another country, even in the early days when it was possible, they would have to go to the very Gestapo who were hunting them in order to get the proper paperwork. And again, that was constantly changed very cleverly. For example, just some of the deception that they used in getting Jews out of the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka, they would have Jews write postcards right on the way to Treblinka saying, we're fine, we have work, we're not hungry, things are okay. And then those would be mailed back to the ghetto. So people in the actual ghetto would receive them. They know Uncle Aaron's handwriting, and this had a tendency to quell all the rumors. One of the most astounding examples that I've heard of is the very bottom of the chain of prisoners was something called the Sonderkommando, who were responsible for emptying the gas chambers themselves. These groups would be rotated every few weeks, and they would be gassed and killed themselves, so there would be no witnesses. In any event, we know that one of these men actually took belts from the corpses and tied himself to the bottom of a truck while the engine was hot, burning himself, nevertheless surviving and actually escaping Treblinka. He went back to the Warsaw Ghetto to warn his fellow Jews, and he was not believed. He simply was not believed. He was considered a madman. The strain had been too much for him. And so you have this terrible irony of somebody actually telling the truth and not being believed. And one of the best lessons I've ever had on the Holocaust was a survivor telling me, you know, you have to understand, before the Holocaust, there was no Holocaust. This could not even be imagined. Who would do this? What could they possibly gain? People would be arguing, you know, I fought against the Germans in World War I. I know they're not monsters. What we are capable of working. We could help the war effort, the German war effort. Why would we be put to death, as some of these people are claiming? So even though eyewitnesses return, it simply could not be believed. And that seems to me instructive for trying to understand the mindset of why more people didn't resist and so on. So.
There's so much in history that that is known, and other things are lost in history. Another issue, Bill, that comes up in this whole process, how could this kind of mass killing take place? We've heard the numbers, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but the Jewish population alone, 6 million lives lost. Maybe we don't even know how many other lives were lost, the other categories that you listed. Yeah. How can that take place in any country, even a non-democracy, in a dictatorship, without a large part of the population knowing about it? How can you just have millions and millions die? So were there things in the culture at that time, or in the so-called value system, that had so many people to either ignore what's going on or support and participate? I mean, Hitler couldn't do this by himself.
That's right. Hitler didn't pull up one trigger.
He didn't pull one trigger. Right. So he had a lot of support. So that's my first question, is what data do we have to indicate how common was this? And I know in your presentation here, and you can expand that, even outside of Germany, people knew about this, some leaders around the world.
Sure. We have the case of a man named Lansky, who had a photographic memory and was smuggled in. He was a Polish officer, was smuggled in to, I believe it was either Treblinka or Auschwitz. He was able to memorize the car numbers of the railroad cars, and so he calculated the turnaround time. In other words, they couldn't be going to the east if the cars were back in Warsaw in a matter of 8 or 10 hours. So anyway, he was then smuggled through the Polish underground to New York, and then to Washington, D.C., met with the president, met with Anthony Eden in Britain. And so this was known in 1942, at least by the higher echelons of government, including the Jewish community itself, which remained silent from 1942.
That is outside of Germany.
Yes, until the end of the war. And one of the horrible questions that Elie Wiesel, one of the men I studied, asked is, he says he was a 15-year-old Hasidic Jew in 1944 when the Germans came into his little town in Hungary. He says if they knew in 42 and someone had just said over Radio Free Europe, you know, broadcast on the radio, Jews run for your lives, the Germans are killing you, you know, that sort of thing. He says the Carpathian Mountains were 20 miles from his town in one direction. In the other direction, the Russian army sat across the river, waiting. He said, I think there were about 6,000 Jews in his village. 3 survived. And he is wondering why no one said anything, not even on the radio, a warning. Because he says, yes, hundreds of people would have been killed, but there would be more than 3 survivors. So you have these questions recurring. That's why the study of this subject remains vital.
I have a follow-up question. That I was given a speech some time ago, and I was using some philosophers, and I think Dante was very powerful. He was also a lot of gloom about afterlife and all of this. But Dante said something so powerful, I'm paraphrasing. Of course, you in your philosophy know more than I, but in paraphrasing, he said, the hottest spots in hell are reserved for those who sit on the sidelines in a time of crisis and will not take a stand. Is that pertinent to this particular issue?
Very pertinent. Matter of fact, one survivor has said, because of what happened, everybody in Europe at the time was either a victim or a perpetrator. or a bystander, which doesn't, that speaks directly to your point. There was a whole lot of bystanding, and people certainly, we can go to the Catholic Church, we can go to the Protestant Church, who said nothing or did nothing, and we have examples. One in particular is a little French village named Le Chambon, and Le Chambon had essentially a fundamentalist preacher who said the Jews are God's chosen people, they should be protected and comforted. There are more survivors from Le Chambon than Schindler's Jews because of what those people did, and they hid 500 or so Jewish children, even though that city, that town, was a Nazi R&R center. Nazi officers went there to relax. So we have that one example, but the trouble is, what does it do to all the other French towns, French cities that could have done the same thing? And I mentioned in that presentation Denmark, where the King of Denmark puts on the first Star of David, and no Jews are ever shipped from Denmark. So what does that say about Holland and all the other countries that might have resisted more than they did?
Janelle Burke.
My question is really a two-part question. The first part of the question is, where can people go to learn more about this? But the second part of it is I want to hone in on the identification and also on the passing of laws, the expropriation part of this whole context. With regard to identification, I didn't ever understand that until I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and then I could suddenly understand. They were using even very elementary IBM machines with card sorters to be able to identify people, and they were identifying them, of course, through these other mechanisms that you mentioned, like hair color, nose type, and so forth. So talk a little bit more about this identification and then about the expropriation and the taking away of civil freedoms, which really perpetuated the movement into the third category.
In terms of identification, the question of Jewishness, as I said, remains an open one. There are instances where people have said, anyway, kind of like folklore, especially in the Warsaw Ghetto, as you know, it was enclosed around with what were called the Aryan side. And people gave up, essentially, those who had been their neighbors. They said they could identify Jews by they had sad eyes, or they smelled differently, or any number of ways to identify them. And in one case, in a place in Poland, a police battalion, a reserve police battalion, this is from a book called Ordinary Men, which takes on the idea that the Nazis were ideologues and you had to be that way in order to carry this out. His conclusion is nothing could be further than the truth. Everyone participated in this. And he uses this example where a Nazi officer actually took his bride on a honeymoon to this place, where they conducted after breakfast Jew hunts, where they would go out, find Jews, bring them back, and kill them. And in this particular place, because these men were not particularly militarily trained or anything, they had to take the victims by the hand, one by one, into the woods to the killing site. And they were so untutored in this that they didn't know to shoot them in the back of the neck and instead put the rifle to their skull and blew their brains out all over themselves, and then had to go back and get another victim. This caused several of them not only to stop doing it, but the significant thing is they were never punished. They were never killed. They never even lost rank or service. They were simply said, okay, you go to the trucks and wait, and no punishment was ever. So what does that do to the excuse that, well, we had to do it, we have no choice, we would have been killed ourselves? It's much like the earlier point you brought up. Didn't these people know? One of the places we visited in Poland was called Majdanek, one of the 6 death camps. And Majdanek could be seen from a 4-story building. The smell of all of these camps is graphically described by every survivor and every liberator. but denied by the various local populations. Well, in Majdanek, in the city of Lublin, you had to get off the train station and be marched to the death camp, So that excuse often doesn't hold water, and we didn't believe them. We made the Germans or the Poles or whoever it was clean up the very camps and so on. And General Eisenhower is famous for what he said about that, and those words, if you remember, are inscribed on the museum in Washington, D.C.
This is just so troubling, and as someone who studied history some myself, and of course I've been in the field of political science, I've certainly studied some, but I've never had anyone to be so explicit and vivid and talking about what a dark time it was and what a Holocaust. We're almost out of time, but we're going to have you back next week, fortunately, and we're going to continue it. But I think there's another lesson here in what you've been saying today, and that is under the system we created over 200 years ago, and James Madison deserves the credit, that we did create a constitutional system of separation of powers between the Congress and the executive and the judiciary, and also federalism between the national government and the states. Isn't that one safeguard? What happened with Hitler, he was able to take all three branches of government and combine it under his control, and no one did anything without his permission. So isn't there some structural things you can do that increase the chances of this not happening?
Yes, I think you're right on the money. That's a very critical part of freedom, or what we today call human rights. And as I mentioned in the presentation, there's one thinker named Hannah Arendt who says, the only human rights you have are those you can defend. And to talk about it in the abstract simply doesn't work.
That is something that we're going to pursue with you next week, too.
Okay.
Among other things, that's really deserves a lot of attention. Bill Prosser, you're not only a great friend, but you're such an intellect, and what a contribution you're making to our program and to our viewers. We thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing this with you next week.
Well, thank you. I'm afraid you're too kind, but thank you.
Certainly I'm not, and I know Janelle joins me in that.
I do.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've had part one today of the horrors of the Holocaust, and I know you have found this a very sobering and very, very sad subject, but it's something that is very important to know, because through knowledge we increase the chance of not repeating those terrible times in history. Again, I invite you to be with us again next week at this same time, when we will have Bill Prosser back for part two to discuss the horrors of the Holocaust. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.